Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Talkin Wellness. My name is Christian.
And I'm Kayla.
And we're coming back with another special episode. We have a guest, as you can see, joining us today on the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself, please, and what you do here?
I am Lyndsey, and I am an adult recovery care specialist.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to pass off the baton to Kayla because she's going to let us know exactly what we're going to talk about, as you probably already know by the title. But she's going to let us know, okay?
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so we are actually going to deep dive into a conversation surrounding harm reduction and really focus on your lived experience and I guess some of like the knowledge and what insights and things that you've come to understand because harm reduction played a huge role in your recovery journey. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding harm reduction and the beliefs around it. So I really want to just kind of like rip the Band-Aid off and pass it on to you and really talk about like your journey and how harm reduction played a role into your recovery process and just kind of like what that all looked like. And then we'll ask some questions as you share.
Okay. So for me, you know, my story with substance use started at a young age. I think I was like 15 when I tried my first substance. But when it comes to, you know, harm reduction, I knew nothing of the sort until I was in my 20s. I had just had my 16-year-old, so he was not even a year old. And
can you actually give our listeners, because we may have some listeners that for this may be the first time they're ever hearing the term harm reduction. So will you actually put some like definition to what that
Yeah,
means?
absolutely. So I had a total definition change as I got older and I understood more about it. But for me then, it was making sure that, you know, during my active use that I was staying safe and avoided things that were going to cause potential harm and to get my life back. And for me, that was getting off the needle and not having my mom come in my room every night, making sure I was still breathing and being able to reclaim being a mom and just getting my life back. Because at that point I was at my darkest, and honestly, I used to the point where I really didn't care my consequences. I really didn't want to live. I wasn't living.
So how did this concept of harm reduction, like basically reducing the harm of, at this point would be like of your use, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in, I guess, any kind of when we're looking at like things that we're doing in our life is like this idea of like doing things that are going to support healthier choices or reduce the harm in some of the choices that we may be making in our life. So how did the role of harm reduction play in your recovery or your journey into your pathway of recovery?
So one of the dangers I was putting myself in is that, so I was part of the pill mill epidemic. If you're unsure of what that was, I had a back injury in college, and I went to a doctor, and pretty much all you needed back then was a bad MRI, and I was like the golden ticket standard because I also had surgery.
Wow.
So I was prescribed copious amounts of narcotics, and
Is that actually how you were introduced to your drug of choice?
mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I dabbled here and there in college, but I never had where I was taking it every day and was building that tolerance and that dependency to where I was like, oh man, I'm kind of not feeling good now that I, you know, missed a day or missed a couple hours. I was starting to feel what it felt like to be physically dependent on a substance.
Would that be like withdrawal? Like you were feeling withdrawal from the substance?
Absolutely. And not even like body symptoms. I was also having emotional dysregulations to where I was getting agitated and I was lashing out and just being heightened, like, you know, manipulating and just making sure that I had it at all costs. I didn't care. I would say like the meanest things, you know, like, you want me to be sick, you know, like, I'm not going to be a good person unless, you know, you fund my habit.
Mm-hmm.
And
so there was this aspect of physical pain that you were experiencing,
Yeah.
right? Where it made the medication very valid to be prescribed because you were in physical pain.
Mm-hmm.
However, do you feel like that you lacked the education about the actual medication that you were taking?
Absolutely. I was never told the consequences of being on such a strong opiate. I know back then as well, I don't think all the doctors had all the knowledge. It was a newer medication. And, that was the epidemic in itself for pill mills. It was like, they were pushing it. And
I think part of like the lawsuit and everything, because they had it signed off that it didn't cause addiction, or like
Right.
it was like less than 2%
Yeah.
or something, the percentage, when in actuality it is an extremely highly
Extremely.
addictive drug,
Extremely.
And it's interesting, and I'm really glad that you're sharing this perspective, because I feel a lot of the time we kind of leave those individuals out that like come into, their addiction through like, pain, like actually having some form of physical pain. And I look at it also from the standpoint of like youth that are athletes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they have like an injury or something happens, they blow out their knee, and they start to get prescribed a medication and lack the actual correct information about the medication.
Right.
And they end up getting addicted to this medication, not just physically, but psychologically. Because one thing that I learned from an incredible doctor, Dr. Lloyd, who Dope Sick, the show and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, is that with opiates, so a person that's addicted to opiates, right? So opiates will obviously reduce your pain, right? Like it is a medication taken for people that feel pain to not feel that pain. Your brain, emotional pain and physical pain, there's no distinction.
Right.
So an opiate will actually support if you have emotional pain too.
Mm-hmm.
So think about the amounts of people that maybe end up with a prescription that also maybe have some undealt with trauma and maybe even susceptible, right, by a genetic disposition
Which
to
was
addiction.
me across
right.
the board.
Yeah.
I was like, what is this drug? I like it. Give me more. Yeah. I didn't feel any of that anxiety that I grew up feeling and didn't understand why I felt it. And it was like I finally found this cure. Little did I know that it was going to completely destroy my life in the long run.
Yeah. So let's talk about that progression, just so our listeners kind of have an idea too of like what that progression looked like. So you're, prescribed this medication, it's during like the pill mill time and all of that. And how did that actually progress into, you said that you use needles, right? And it kind of got to that point where you were literally going to die.
So I'm going to get raw for a minute, because I know if any other addict that has experienced this pill mill epidemic, your story is probably going to be very similar to mine. So back then, you would be allowed to be prescribed the same medication, but in 2 doses. So I'd get the same medication at a high dose and then half of that dose. Well, then a new law was put in effect where you couldn't do that. And the doctors wanted to find the loophole. So they prescribed me a different medication. That medication you cannot get high from unless you use a needle, and it's intravenous. Well, I didn't want to waste a whole bottle of pain medication. And, being around other addicts like myself, I figured out, the solution to my problem. And within a week, I was off to the races. All it took was one time having someone do it for me and, learning how to do it. And like that fear was never there, because wanting to feel numb and to mask any pain I was feeling was more important than the fear behind trying to do it myself.
That's really powerful. I'm sure there's a lot of people that can resonate to that. What would you say would be like kind of that turning point where you obviously, this was a solution, right, originally to like a physical problem, which then became a bigger problem because they were underlying things too, right? So now you have the physical and psychological dependence. Where would you say was like the turning point for you where you kind of began to take a different route, right? Which is where we're going to talk about the role of harm reduction in your life and like how that supported even you to where you're at today.
So I think because my tolerance was so high, I remember one time, so I'd run out of my medication within 2 weeks. And then obviously like I had to go out and buy more to get me by so that I wouldn't get sick. And I remember going into a doctor, because then you could doctor shop. You know, everything wasn't electronic. They wasn't connected by all pharmacies and doctors. And I remember going in there and I was so sick. I was so sick. And I was sitting in the back and I already paid. You had to pay right when you got in to even see somebody. And it was a new doctor. They'd never seen me before. And they finally called me back because they could see I was sweating. I had goosebumps. I was crying because I was so sick. And they took me in the back and they have to do your blood pressure and do your vitals. And I took off my jacket and they could tell right away that I had my arm fully covered in makeup. And they washed it off and they looked right at me and said, "Get out," called me a junkie, told me never get back. And I felt so much shame and guilt in that moment and was like, what am I doing? You know? And so that's when I started my journey of going into a detox. And that's kind of like where I learned my first information about harm reduction, and Suboxone was given there. My issue is that the second I started to feel even an inkling of being sick, because they have this list of symptoms they ask you, and you have to check off so many on the list before they'll prescribe you your first dose of Suboxone. I could never make it all the way down that list. And I would call my mom and say, "Mom, I can't do this. Like, if you don't come pick me up, I'm just going to
What was like the
leave."
list, if you don't mind me asking?
So it started off with like, you know, teary eyes or, you know, the goosebumps. You know, then it was like malaise and body pains and stomach pains. And then, you know, the coming out both sides, you know, it just progresses the more you're in withdrawal.
Right.
And I couldn't make it. The second I felt that the body, because I still had a bad back.
Right.
So I felt like it intensified when I was starting to get sick.
Yeah.
And it was almost like that mental trigger went off of, oh my God, this is about to happen. And I would freak out and I'd be like, "Get me out of here." Like, I just wasn't ready.
Yeah.
So, I tried that like once or twice. I even went, so my mom was a social worker, and God bless her and for being so educated on addiction. And I have to thank that for one of the providers that worked at the hospital she worked at, that he specialized in addiction and actually prescribed Suboxone. So he was able to kind of give her wisdom of what addiction looked like, and you know, to not be so hard on me and to support me, which is really ultimately what I needed. Because I did have a lot of judgment around me, and I had that one like supportive person that, you know, understood and never left my side. And so I went, you know, to his clinic and got some therapy. So not only was harm reduction now a therapy aspect as well, to heal my mental health, I was able to start taking Suboxone and do it the right way and not be scared, and feel supported in that. So that's kind of like where it started. But again, I wasn't ready.
Yeah. Do you feel like there was, like, when you were going through the process of taking a medication, which was Suboxone, so which assisted in your recovery, that there was still stigma around the fact that you were on a medication? And like, I kind of want to ask you too, because obviously, like, I'm in recovery. I've been through, you know, the 12-step fellowship. I've been in different kind of recovery groups, and I have seen, you know, some people embracing and some people like not so much, right? And so, like, as a person who actually utilized Suboxone in their pathway of getting better, what was that experience like for you? Did you feel support from the recovery community? Had you even tapped into the recovery community? What did that look like?
So I had not even heard of a 12-step meeting at this point. I didn't feel judgment for being on Suboxone because nobody knew. It literally, my mom and I were the only ones that knew. But like I said, I wasn't ready. So I continued to use the needle, and that's where I progressed to like my mom checking on me all the time.
So while you were on Suboxone, you were still using the needle.
I because they give you your prescription and you're allowed to take it home, I just decided not to take it. And so I would just continue using. It was like a vicious cycle.
Got it.
Like I would get on it, off it, on it, off it. Now at this point, I was only on prescribed opiates. With most in addiction, at least for myself, like it's a ever evolving progressive thing, right? So I started getting into more harder substances, and I was having to wait even longer to start the Suboxone. So the fear of precipitated withdrawal, which is if you take this medication and you still have, say, heroin or fentanyl in your system, you are going to go into withdrawal and there's no getting out of it. And so that was a really big fear of mine. And I don't think it's talked about enough because, it's not that we don't want to stop, and we do have this life-saving medication, but we also don't want to be sick. Once you experience that, and, they say compare it to the flu. No, it's so much worse than the flu. Like, it's undescribable. And there's no way to thwart that. Like, you get sick with the flu, you could take NyQuil or take Benadryl or whatever to help you sleep. That it doesn't help you in that situation.
I'm really glad you're shedding light to that, because I think that a lot of the time people don't understand opiate and opiate addiction, or even like what opiates do in the body. And so it's easy to cast a judgment of like, just stop, like, don't do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like it's easy to cast a judgment of like, oh, well, you're on Suboxone, well, that's still a drug. Like, so you're just switching out one thing for the other. And I want to debunk, some of these misconceptions about things and just like the lack of understanding that people have around it, because like, yeah, comparing it to the flu, I think, maybe like, I don't know, maybe like a killer flu or whatever, like on your deathbed. But really, I even have a lot of people compare, because like now when you look at even prescription medication that's being bought off the street, typically the pills are being made and there's fentanyl in it, right?
Yeah.
Like everything's mixed in with fentanyl. And I even think when you look at the potency of fentanyl, we're talking about like withdrawals that like literally feel like death, right? And so you have to imagine that somebody that is in that, like, you're already unstable because you're obviously like addicted to a substance that you're trying to use to support whatever you got going on. So I can imagine like the fear of like, okay, we remove this, or I put this other thing into my body that's supposed to help me, but here's the parameters and it could make me deathly sick. So those are like real fears to have, that like any human being in that proposition would feel those fears, and it's like a strong thing in your mind. So the other question I want to ask you is like, with Suboxone, like, how do you feel that Suboxone helped you, or that it hindered you?
So, and I know we are going to discuss, my second route of harm reduction, but for me, I definitely think it helped when I needed it the most. But the thing was, I still wasn't mentally ready. And I did not have, like, yes, I would go in and I would meet with this therapist. I don't remember, it was so long ago. I think maybe like 30 minutes once every time I went to pick up my prescription. Like, that was the parameters of getting your prescription, was you had to talk to this person or attend groups. I was so young and not educated and as well, my son's father was still using. So it was like, I just wasn't ready. And I knew that I was at the point where I was just giving up and didn't care anymore. And like, I was okay with whatever came my way. And
can I ask you, what did that look like? That point that you're describing there, where it's like you were just feeling this overwhelming sense of like, I want to give up. Like, I'm not interested in well, whatever that thing is. What did that look like in your life?
So because it was so hard to stop and start the Suboxone, and I was using more and more, and it was getting harder every time. And my fear of getting sick, because if you ask anybody that's gone through the withdrawal process, especially doing it cold turkey and not having any medication, it's like, how many days can you lay in bed and every day feels like it's getting worse? And when you have this cure, which is the drug, and you know that if you take it instantly, you will not feel those symptoms anymore. It's like, it's a mind game.
It really is, yeah. Because I can resonate with, I got addicted to opiates too. I had no idea about the withdrawal. I didn't know. I did not know that if I was taking this medication and consistently taking it, right? And that's what happened is I started taking it and I kept taking it because I liked the way that it was making me feeling. And then all of a sudden I didn't have the medication. Okay. And I never got it prescribed. So it was not prescribed medication. I was so sick. I thought I was dying from the flu. That's why I said, like, you feel,
Yeah, you
and
can't
I was
go
out,
to work.
but I didn't know I was in withdrawal.
Oh no.
I had no idea because I had no information about any of it. I was just doing different types of substances, and that was something that I ended up trying and liking, and I continued to do it without the knowledge of like what this was going to do to me. So I'm glad that you talk about that because it is such a mind game, right? Had I known, I think it's a good thing I didn't know because then I made it through to the other side, but had I known that something was going to make me better, because I was trying to do everything to make me better, okay, then I probably would have, because your mind is like, you're operating in survival, like what part of your brain, and I think we forget the brain science behind addiction a lot of the time. We're missing that piece, and we look at the moral failing or just make it through all these things, but like when your brain is doing everything it can to survive this moment, and there's this, that it's like, when we look at like the studies on it, right, with the rats that they've done all of these studies, and we have the research that shows this, but we kind of forget it when we're like faced human to human, and you're wondering like, why does this person keep making these decisions? Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up. I think that's like really powerful, and I kind of want to turn it now to really looking at like when harm reduction actually met you where you were at, and provided support to your healing process.
So I always, you have these God moments, at least I do. And I remember I was walking out of the bathroom. Obviously, I had just, done what I needed to do to feel better. And my mom like shoves this newspaper article in my face. And it was like front page. Like it was screaming at us. And it was this I want to say 61-year-old woman who had same issue with, the pill mill situation, getting addicted. And she had went to the methadone clinic, and it completely saved her life. And at that point, I was like all out of options. Like it was either like try this or die. Like there was no in between. Like it was like my last resort. And I was like, when you just kind of drop down on your knees and say like, I surrender, I had that moment. And I said, okay, like call them, let me go, and that started my journey, dark and light moments of harm reduction. But it started my journey to reclaim who I was as a person and get stabilized to some degree.
Good. Okay. So, and, really talking about medication assisted recovery, and that's why I like calling it, not just medication assisted treatment, but medication assisted recovery, because I think, when we look at recovery in terms of any recovery process, right? Like we're talking right now about like substance use and addiction, but even looking at mental health, like there are absolutely times where medication assists the recovery process, right? And it is a huge helpful component of the recovery process, and it is a strategy of harm reduction, right? It absolutely is. There's multiple other strategies of harm reduction depending on what we're talking about or referencing, but we're obviously referencing this right now. But what were other components? Because I think sometimes that it's missing in that, right? Is like we talk about, medication assisted treatment or medication assisted recovery, and we talk about the medication piece, but what were the other components that you can say, like, these were also things that were supporting in that? Because I don't think it's just one thing. I think it's a component of things. Can you talk to that?
I think with just one thing, it's not successful. At least it wasn't for me. So when I first got introduced to a methadone clinic, I obviously, like, I needed to be stabilized at a pretty high dose. And you go in there, and where I went, it was, you see a therapist, you see the doctor, you have to go to a 12-step meeting, you have to take your paper, get it signed, go in, show that you are making efforts toward your recovery. And I didn't even know what a 12-step meeting really was. And I had accountability, and I think that was the biggest thing. And, I was able to get to a stable dose. I will say, we talked about the stigma towards being on a medication-assisted treatment. I remember, like, I was like, oh my gosh, I found my people. I joined, like, a women's group 12-step, and I asked if I could chair the meeting. One of the old-timers, that we like to call it, found out that I was on methadone and completely was, like, against me chairing the meeting. Like, was like, absolutely not allowed. And it kind of, like, it was hurtful. Yeah. Like, that shame and that guilt come back, And I'm not going to lie, I stopped going. I was like, I already have enough guilt, like. But the good thing is, like, still in that time, I went back to school. I got my esthetician's license. My parents had guardianship over my son because they were afraid, knowing that both his parents were actively using, that if something happened, where would he go, my son? And so they had guardianship over him. And I'll never forget the day that I got to go to that courthouse and have the guardianship removed and get full custody of my son back. As you both know, his father did die from this disease. He was also on methadone toward the end of his life, and we can discuss how harm reduction is so beneficial when it comes to overdose. But this is the thing. So what happened was, I was stable and I was ready to start coming off. I felt like I was ready. You could be on it the rest of your life. If you are living a productive, healthy life and the medication is helping, by all means, like, who's to say that you don't need to be on it anymore? But for me, I felt like, you know what, I want to try this thing. Like, I'm feeling strong in my recovery. Let me see if I can do without it. And I started the long process of lowering my dose. And that's the other thing. I was at a really high dose, and I think that everyone's body and chemistry is different, and maybe I needed that in the beginning, but I didn't need to be that high of a dose, and I could feel like I was having to take a nap every time I would take my medication for like 45 minutes after, or I would get sick and I would throw up in the car on the way home because my body was telling me it was too much medication.
Yeah.
And so I got down to, I want to say, like 3 milligrams, like I was about to get off, and then got the worst news of my life, that my son's father had lost his life to this disease. And I was not mentally prepared for that. I don't think anybody is, because the last I knew, he was doing okay. I talked to him like 2 days prior, and I remember going to my psychiatrist's office, and, like, obviously, like, I wasn't fully fixing my mental health, so I still had those manipulation tendencies and those character defects that I knew I needed to work on but didn't know how to identify. And I knew what to say. I went in there, sunglasses on, could not stop crying. It was like, please stop this pain. And I got prescribed anti-anxiety medications, and because that's not my drug of choice, within 2 weeks I was off to the races again. And for 2 years, just, numbing that grief.
Right. So you look at that part of your life and you look at today. I it's always something that I notice with every single guest that comes to the podcast. You know, I see a lot of growth. I see a lot of change, right? I think the first time I ever experienced that is when that episode when we first heard Kayla's story, from beginning all the way to end, and seeing how that Kayla is not the Kayla that I got to know today, and the same thing's happening now. That Lyndsey that you're describing is not the Lyndsey that I know today. So obviously, I'm curious to hear from your own words, what is keeping you so inspired to keep your recovery?
So, after I had that reoccurrence and I had my 2-year stint, I tried to take my life, and I remember like going into a crisis unit and having intensive therapy and being like, okay, there's more, there's more for me to have offered. And I started, I had been back on the methadone at that point, and I started lowering my dose again. And this is why I wanted to mention that it's such a great tool, even when somebody's not fully ready. Because what happened was, and this is what keeps my recovery going today, I had a slip up and I was so low on my dose. Whenever I was on my dose, and because when I went back to the methadone clinic for the second time, I went to a different clinic. This clinic did not do therapy. This clinic would drug test you. That was it. I was testing positive every time for my drug of choice and the methadone. Never once did they call me in the office and say, "Are you okay?"
So there were like no parameters.
No parameters.
Yeah.
They did not care. I was a number in the system, and that's why I wanted to say the good things about medication-assisted treatment when you're actually getting that wraparound treatment, and when you're just there for the medication, and it's not going to be successful for me at least.
Those extra components that are really
absolutely
important.
100%. And I remember, so I would use and be on methadone, but my tolerance would be so high that I would never overdose because I had this harm reduction medication in my body that was allowing me to stay safe.
Yeah.
And I think people need to remember that even if somebody's not ready, to not judge somebody for using or being on, practicing harm reduction at the same time, because it's still saving your life.
Right.
I got to a low enough, almost non-existent dose of methadone, and I overdosed twice in 1 week. And I remember waking up in a parking lot with Narcan behind me, thinking it was the day before, and not knowing how I got there. And I was so scared. It was like that wake-up call I needed to be like, holy crap, I almost just made my son an orphan. And I have kids that rely on me. And I was like, Lyndsey, you cannot keep doing this. Like, something needs to give. And I finally dived fully into wraparound care, which was therapy, treating my inner child trauma, which I had never wanted to touch before, healing resentments. That was a big one. For me, it was giving everything to God. Like, literally just being like, God, take over. Like, I give that symbolism of, like, we're driving in the car and we have our hand on the wheel, and I had my hand on the wheel for so many years and it was steering me the wrong places. And like, just being like, you have a bigger plan in store for me. You already have it laid out. I just need to follow it and listen. And that changed my life. Like, that literally changed my life. And I don't know, like, building community, that was huge. I isolated myself in addiction. I didn't have friends. I had nobody. The one person I can connect to was my oldest son's father. Well, he was no longer there. We had that relationship where we both knew the pain of addiction, and we could, tell each other our deepest, darkest secrets without judgment. I lost that, So yeah, I really had to dive deep into my mental health, and I didn't want to be on any medication. That was my choice. And and really live purposely and authentically. And yeah, today, like I tell you all the time, like I want to live to be honest. Like I want integrity today. And I feel like, you know, loving myself allows for others to love me, and showing up for people today. Like, I don't want to lose that, you know?
Yeah.
Pretty awesome. Pretty powerful stuff. You've definitely reclaimed a lot, and
a lot has changed.
Have built a lot more, right? And so just in closing, because I think this has been like such a powerful episode and really talking about from your perspective, because I learned a lot through you sharing honestly and transparently. So I really appreciate that. But what would you want our listeners to take away from this and really to know about harm reduction and recovery?
I mean, like any recovery pathway is possible, you know, and you should never be judged for what you think is going to help you live a healthy life. And, you know, I'm sorry if anyone ever feels that shame or guilt for whatever medication or harm reduction they practice. You know, like if it's saving your life, it's doing the job. And that's all we can ask for. Like, I don't want to see more people dying because of this disease. Like, and just to have hope, because like I had no hope. I had none. I was like, I'd rather be dead than keep living like this. And I was like, I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with just no longer being alive, until I was so close to not being alive that I was like, holy crap, Lyndsey, like you got to do something and do it now, you know? So I want everyone to know that like the recovery journey is theirs to embrace and to have full control over, and to advocate for yourself. And if you feel like you're not being treated fairly, like, you know, you have a voice, and to remember that you have a voice. So.
Amazing. Awesome. And I do have to plug into before like we wrap it up is that Lyndsey's also going to be speaking, because we're doing a panel, which we're so excited, breaking stigma through education, conversation, and advocacy. And I think that it really just starts there, right? Conversations and education. And that's how we learn how to advocate, and we actually are making more informed decisions, and we have a more informed understanding of things, because we can all have biases and misconceptions about things until we actually pursue to learn a little bit more. And you're only going to learn by actually stepping into those spaces and learning from individuals that have those experiences and actually listening to the other side of it. So we hope to see you guys. It's going to be at our South location, 6969 Taft Street, Hollywood, Florida, on Tuesday of next week. That is going to be May 13th, starting at 6 o'clock. So we'll have refreshments, and we're going to have a really good time. Lyndsey's one of the speakers, one of the panelists, but we have several other panelists that are going to be talking from different aspects of recovery, their lived experience, and just really a lot of the knowledge and insight that comes with this topic. So
thank you guys for having me.
Hi, everybody. Make sure to like, subscribe. You know what to do. See you guys next time. Bye. I don't know what that was.